Hi, and welcome to Introduction to ClaySys AppForm Advanced Features. This is part 1 of this video series. The features that we will demo in this session are 1. Saving data in a form to 2 SharePoint lists. 2. Working with a web service. 3. Working with a grid control. 4. Working with the drop-down control, which reads the data from a list. 5. Configure cascading drop-downs in a grid. 6. Adding basic rules in a form. To demonstrate the features in part 1 of this video, we will be working with an order form which saves to 2 lists. I will give you a brief demo of the form we are going to create. This form saves to 2 different lists, order list and order details list. Here, I will enter the data in the text boxes and the grid control. When you enter a zip code, it will read the city and state from an online web service. We have 2 drop-down controls in the grid, and you can see that the second drop-down will refresh based on the value entered in the first column. Selecting the product will read and populate the quantity per unit and rate of that product from the list. When you enter the quantity, it will calculate the total amount for that product in the grid. The total amount, shipping amount, and net amount will also be calculated based on the values you enter in the grid. I will go ahead and save the record. Now I can go to the lists and show you the data that is saved. You can see the order and the order details saved to these lists. The relationship between these 2 lists is the order ID. Now we will go to the SharePoint site and create this form. In this SharePoint site, we have a list with the categories of the product. The next list is for products. I have imported the data to these lists from the Northwind database. The other 2 lists, where the data will be saved, are orders and order details. The order ID from the orders list will be saved to order details list to maintain the relationship. The order ID is the default ID column in the orders list. This will be auto-generated. After saving data to the orders list, this order ID will be saved to the order details list. Now, I will go to ClaySys AppForms option under the Site Actions menu. Folder Explorer is a Windows Explorer-like view in the central admin where you can create the folders and forms in AppForms. Here, I will create a new folder and name it Orders. We can create a new form by clicking on the New Form button in the toolbar. Now we can give this form a name, Order Management. We can change the width and height of the form as required. We can adjust the width of the columns. The first column will be used for setting the margin of the controls to be placed in the second column. Now, we can rearrange the other columns as required. We can also add additional columns using the button in the toolbar. I have added 4 more columns here. I will change the cell span of the cell in the second row and second column to 8. Then place a label control in that cell, which be the title of the form. Format the font in the labeling. Change the text to Order Management. The Properties pop-up will have all the commonly used attributes of a control. The Advanced Properties panel on the right side of the designer will allow you to change the other attributes of the control. The width and height of the control can be changed by clicking and dragging the highlighted border on the right and bottom sides of the selected control. I will click on the Save button to save the changes that I have done in this form. Now, I will place the required controls for the first field, Order ID. We need to use a label and text box. Both the text box and label controls can be found under the section Standard in the toolbox. I will have the text Order ID for the label and name the text box TXT Order ID. We can use the Properties pop-up to set these properties. The controls look and feel will change in real time based on the property you change This will help the user visualize the look and feel for the end user. I will uncheck the Enable property to disable the Order ID text box because it will be auto-generated. Once I finalize the width of the controls, I can resize the column again. I can now copy the label control and use it for the next fields, order date, and shipping date, so that I don't need to reformat the other labels. Once I paste the label, I just need to change the text property. In this case, I change the label text to order date. I will paste the label again for the shipping date and change the text of the label to shipping date. The label width needs to be adjusted so that we have the label text in one line. I will now place date picker control for the order date. This control is also under the section Standard in the toolbox. Change the width to 110 and name the control DT order date, then change the format to MMDDYYYY. As we discussed earlier, the format property of the control is not available in the Properties pop-up, so I will go to the Properties panel to change it. Now, I can copy this date picker control and use that for the shipping date, so that I just need to give a new name. The new name will be DT shipping date. I need to place a heading for the next section, shipping details. So, I will change the cell span of the cell to 3, then copy and paste the label order ID. The text of the label will read shipping details. I can change the width and format the font. For now, I will make it bold and underline to give it a feel of heading. I can come back and format the labels later once I'm done with all the form functionalities. So, let us concentrate on placing the rest of the form controls and get a basic user interface ready. I will place 3 more labels for customer name, address, and zip code. I will go back and copy and paste the same order ID label so that I don't need any formatting done other than changing the label texts. As the text customer name does not fit in the label with the current width, I will increase the width slightly so that I can see the complete text in one line. I will copy the new label for the other 2 controls in the same column. Then change the text of the first label to address and the second one to zip code. The text box for the customer name and address will span 3 cells. I can now drag and drop a text box in the cell with the span of 3. This text box will be for customer name. I will change the width to 275. The name of the text box can be TXT customer name. I am just following the prefix with the control name so that we know the type of control we are using. This will come handy when we use the control name in the rules configuration and data source column mapping. I will pause the video and place all the other form controls and format it as required. Now that I have completed the shipping details section, I will add more rows so that we can design the next section in the form. I'm going to place a dynamic grid control in the next row, so we'll change the cell span to 8. Before placing the grid, I will place the controls for the summary section. Total amount, shipping charges, and net amount will be the controls we will need in the summary section. I have copied an existing label for these controls and pasted them as required. Now I will change the text of each label I pasted. The labels will read total amount, shipping charges, and net amount. The total amount will be the sum of the product rate for the quantity selected in the grid. Shipping charges will be 10% of the total amount. The net total will be the sum of total amount and shipping charges. The labels will read total amount, shipping charges, and net amount. I have paused the video and added text boxes for these 3 rows. The dynamic grid could control is under the data section in the toolbox. I will drag and drop a control in the cell where I have changed the column span. I will now change the width and height. Let us check the form in preview to see the end-user view of this form. Now we can learn how to configure a web service to read the state and city when the user enters the zip code. Working with web service, I have taken an online web service added to the data source settings. This is a weather service, but I will use the same here to read the city and state based on the zip code. I will go back to the Forms Explorer, double-click on the form to open it. Now we are in the Forms Designer, where we can continue the web service configuration. The logic here is to populate the city and state when the user enters the zip code. We have the Data Source panel on the left side of the Designer. Clicking on the Data Source button will bring up the Data Source panel. I will click on the Create Data Source button to create a new web service data source. This will bring up the data source we created in the data source settings. Select the data source and click Next. Clicking on the Add button will show the web methods available in the web service. I will select the web method Get City Forecast by Zip and click Next. The next screen will show the SOAP request. We need to click Next so that we can map the form controls to the web request parameters. The next screen brings up the response SOAP request. You can map the output parameters to the form controls. I am mapping the TXT city and TXT state to the output parameters, just like I mapped TXT zip code in the input parameters. Clicking Next will give you the option to give the command a name. In this case, I will name it Select State and City. Once we have given the command a name, we need to decide on when this command should be executed. Clicking on the Finish button will take you back to the command screen, where you can find a button, Manage Execute Rule, next to the command we just created. Clicking on this button will allow you to define the time when you want the command to be executed. I want this command to be executed when the user enters the zip code, so I select the TXT zip code changed event here. Clicked on Create Rule and then Finish button. Now, I will save the form and go to the preview to test the web service configuration. You can see that the city and state is populated when I enter a valid zip code. Now, we can work on the commands that will allow us to save to two lists, and we will also work with a grid control and the rules engine. First, I will place a button control. This control will be used to save the form data to the lists. In AppForms, you can save to more than one list. There is no restriction on the number of data sources that can be used in a single action. I will change the button text to Save and change the button name to BTN Save. Once I'm done with the final formatting of the button control, I can now go to the Data Sources panel to create a new data source. I will have to create a new SharePoint data source to save the data to the order list. I will click on Create Data Source button and select SharePoint as the data source type. This will show us all the lists and libraries available in the current site. I will select Orders as the list where I want to save the data. Now, I will create an insert command that can be configured to insert data to the order list. Clicking on the Add button will bring the screen where I can map the list columns to the controls in the form. As you can see that the autocomplete text boxes will provide you with the control name selection. The ID column here is an auto-generated column. If you map a control to this column, it will return the new ID that will be generated after you insert the record. The columns are displayed in two pages here, so you will have to open the second page to map the full columns. Once you are done with the column to control mapping, you can click on the OK button and return to the command screen. I want to execute this command when the user clicks on the Save button. So I click on the Manage Execute Rule button and select the BTN Save button on click event as the trigger for this insert command. I click on the Create Rule button, and then Finish button, to complete the wizard. We can now move to the grid control configuration. The grid control has its own data source created when you place the control in the form. To start off with the dynamic grid configuration, you have to go to the Data Sources tab in the Properties pop-up and click on the link, New Data Source Configuration. Then select the data source type as SharePoint. Now it will take you to the screen where you have to define the grid columns and its control types. The first column is the product category. This will be a combo box that will be displaying the details from the category list. The next column will be products. This will be another combo box. But this combo box needs to refresh the data each time the category changes, so I will define the base type of this column as composite column. The next two columns will be quantity and unit, and rate, which will be of the control type label. This is basically to make sure that the values are read-only. If required, we can also place a text box and disable it, but here I am going with a label control to demonstrate different control options available in the dynamic grid. If you see the names that I give for each column, it has a prefix of the column control type and column name. This is just a standard that I am following to know the column type, as I had explained before. I will configure the quantity column as a text box. The total column will also be defined as label, so that it is read only. Now we can configure the category column. Clicking on the Properties button will bring the Properties panel as a pop-up. The combo box has a property, named Items, under the Data Sources section. Select SharePoint as the data source type and click on OK button. Select Categories as the list. We need to display all the values from the list to the combo box, so we will skip the criteria screen and click Next. Here, I will select the ID column as the value member and the category name column as the display member. I will click on the Finish button to complete the combo box configuration. Now we can configure the Products column. As this is a composite column, we will have to have the criteria for displaying the combo box. The criteria will be the selection of a category, so I will add the criteria as the CMB category value not equal to 0. If this condition is satisfied, I need to display the Products combo box. Now that I have added the criteria and the control, I can configure the combo box configuration pointing to the products list. We will select the data source type as SharePoint, and then select Products as the list. We will have to filter the data in the products based on the value the user has selected in the Categories combo box. So I will add the criteria in this screen. Category equals to CMB category. In the next screen, I can select the value member and display member for this combo box. Finally, I will select the Sort option to sort the list based on the product name. Clicking on the Finish button will complete the configuration for the Products combo box. Close all the pop-ups and come back to the Dynamic Grid Column Definition screen. From here you can change the properties of the columns as required. I will change the alignment of the rate column and the amount column. Once I click Next button, after I am done with all the column formatting, it will take me to the next page, where I can select the site where I have my order details list. In this screen, we will select the SharePoint list as order details list. This is the list where I want to save the order details. I will select the command type as insert and click on the Add button. I want to save the order ID from the orders list so that I can maintain the relationship. This command will be executed only after the orders list insert, so the txt order ID text box will have the new order ID generated from the orders list. So, I map this text box to the order ID column. I don't need the order details ID in this scenario, so I will leave this column unmapped. I will complete the other column mapping and click on the OK button. I can now go to the Manage Execute Rule form and select the same Save button as the trigger for this command. As this button has the orders command insert mapped to it first, it will insert to the orders list first and then insert to the order details list. I will click on the Finish button to complete the grid configuration. Now let us save the form and then go to the preview to see how the form looks now. We can see that the grid has rendered the columns with the controls we created. I will change the margin of the grid so that it is in the center of the page. Now that I have the insert commands configured, it's time for us to test the grid combo boxes and the save logic. I can type in the values to the form fields. When I enter the zip code, we can see the web service working. Now when I come to the grid and select the category, you can see that I have a combo box for the products column. Based on the value I select in the categories column, the products combo box will refresh. I will enter the quantity, but the totals will not be generated as we have not created the rule for this. We will come back and create the rules for the total calculation later. Now let's save the record and go to the list to see the saved records. When I go to the orders list, I have one record created with the order ID 1. Now, when I go to the order details list, you can see that we have an order details created with the same order ID. For the purpose of reading the quantity per unit and rate when the user selects a product in the grid, I will place 3 text boxes which will be hidden. I will give the names of these text boxes as TXT product ID, TXT unit, and TXT rate. Now, I will configure a SharePoint data source that will read the quantity per unit and rate when the product is entered in the text box TXT product ID. The logic here is to pass the product ID selected in the grid to this text box TXT product ID and read the rate and unit based on the ID from the grid. I will go ahead and create a new SharePoint data source. Select the list as products. Create a select command. Clicking on the Add button will bring up the screen to configure the select command to read a record from the product list. Here we have 2 sections, query value mappings and query criteria mappings. I will have the TXT unit and TXT rate configured in the query value mapping and TXT product ID as the query criteria mapping to the corresponding columns. In the Manage Execute rule, I will select the text box TXT product ID as the trigger for this command, so that the quantity per unit and rate is selected from the product list when a product ID is selected. Once I am done with the select command configuration, I will click on the Finish button and close the wizard. Now, I need to pass the product ID when the product is selected in the combo box of the grid. For this, I have to create a rule. Select the grid control and open the Rules panel on the left side of the designer. Here, if you click on the Create Rule, a rule will be created for the selected control. Now, I will add a decision to check the column and focus in the grid. If the second column is in focus, that means it is our product combo box. You can see that it is very easy to build a decision using the expression builder in AppForms. Now, I will add an action to pass the selected product ID from the grid to the text box txt product ID. You can find all the controls, functions, variables, operators in the expression builder as separate groups. You need to select the type in this list, and that will populate corresponding items in the second list. When you select a control, you can see all the control properties in the third grid. I can use the function gridGetValue to read the value in the second column in the current row. You can see that the current row property is available for the grid control. I am using that property to configure this function. When the product ID is passed to the text box txt product ID, this will execute the select command and bring back the quantity per unit and rate. We need to add another rule after the command is executed to pass these values back to the grid. If I click on the text box txt product ID and open the Rules panel, I can see the rule created to execute the select command. Now I will add two more actions below this to pass the values back to the grid. To pass a value from a text box to a grid control, I can use the function gridSetValue. I will add the grid name, pass the current row index of the grid as the second parameter, third column for the quantity per unit, and fourth column for the rate. The value will be from the text boxes txt unit and txt rate. Similarly, I will add the action for the rate. I will add the grid name, pass the current row index of the grid as the second parameter, third column for the quantity per unit, and fourth column for the rate. Now, we can go to the preview and see how the rules are coming along. When I select the product ID from the combo box, you can see that the product ID is passed to the text box, which in turn executes the command to read the quantity per unit and rate. Once these values are passed to the text boxes, we push it back to the grid, and you can see that it's working very smoothly as expected. Now, we need to add a rule to calculate the amount in the grid. So I will go back to the Rules panel after selecting the grid control. We have one decision to check for the second column. I will add a new decision to check for the fifth column, which is quantity. Once the user enters the quantity, I will calculate the amount based on the rate and quantity. This example will help you understand the complex scenarios where we can use a function inside another. I will pause the video and complete the action. I have added the other rules for calculating the total amount, shipping charges, and net amount. I will open the actions to show you the expressions, which is easy to understand. We can now go to the preview to check the form. I will enter the dates, phone number, customer name, address, zip code. When I enter the values in the grid, you can see the rules working and the values auto-populated and the amount calculated. The total amount, shipping charges, and net amount is also working as expected. Now let us go to the lists and check the values saved. You can see that the values are saving to multiple lists with the relationship. Now that I have completed all the functionality, I will go back and do some housekeeping tasks in the user interface. I will give the form title a background color, change the font color to white. I will also do the same to the shipping details header label. I will now change the width of the dynamic grid to scale the complete form. Now I will also need to change the column width to match the width of the grid control. Once I am done with the dynamic grid changes, it's the turn of the date picker controls. I can set the default date of these controls to current date. Now move the Save button towards the right side of the form. I will add an alert message to confirm that the data has been saved. Now it's time for me to save the form and check in the form. Now that the form is checked in, it will be available for us to be added as a web part. I will add a ClaySys web part and select the form we created. Now, you can see that the form we created in AppForms is rendered in the SharePoint page as a web part, and I can test all the functionalities.
Thank you for watching this video.